It began with a single statement brief, controlled, almost dismissible. But within hours, it detonated across the world. The palace had confirmed something no one expected, something no one was supposed to know. Catherine, calm, composed, and quietly powerful, was now controlling every guest list across royal residences, not advising, not influencing, controlling. And suddenly, the question wasn't why, it was how long had this already been happening. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it sounded almost procedural, like one of those carefully worded palace clarifications designed to quiet speculation rather than ignite it. But this time, the wording did the opposite. It was precise, deliberate, and impossible to misinterpret. Oversight of guest coordination across royal residences now falls under the Princess of Wales. Oversight, coordination. Words chosen with surgical care, yet heavy with implication. Because within royal tradition, language is never accidental. It is coded power, and those who understood that code immediately realized what had just been revealed. This was not a symbolic adjustment. This was authority centralized, undeniable, and quietly absolute. The reaction was instant. Commentators scrambled to decode the meaning, while insiders remained eerily silent. Social circles that once revolved around proximity to the crown suddenly felt unstable, uncertain. Invitations that had once been predictable now seemed like privileges granted under a new, unseen system, and beneath the noise, something far more unsettling began to surface. This didn't feel new. It felt exposed. Royal watchers, the kind who notice shifts in tone, in seating arrangements, in who stands beside whom, began connecting dots that had long seemed unrelated. A missing name here, an unexpected guest there. Subtle changes that, at the time, were dismissed as coincidence. Now they formed a pattern, because for years, the monarchy had operated on a delicate balance between ceremony and control. Publicly, roles appeared defined, almost rigid. But privately, influence moved differently, fluid, negotiated, often invisible, and what this announcement suggested was that Catherine had crossed that invisible line. She had moved beyond participation into decision-making, beyond presence into power, the kind of power that doesn't announce itself loudly, but instead reshapes systems quietly until, one day, it becomes impossible to ignore. What made it more striking was the contrast. Catherine had built her image on composure, restraint, and quiet loyalty. She was never the loudest voice, never the most controversial figure. And yet, here she was positioned at the center of one of the most sensitive mechanisms within the royal institution. Because guest lists are not just about attendance. They are about access, about influence, about who is allowed into the inner orbit of power and who is kept just outside it. And now, that invisible gate had a single unmistakable keeper. And perhaps the most unsettling implication wasn't just that Catherine held this control, but that it had been operating long before anyone was told. That decisions had already been made. That names had already been filtered. That relationships had already been quietly redefined without public awareness. Because power, when it is truly effective, doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds, slowly, strategically, until the moment it is revealed, feels less like a beginning, and more like a confirmation of something that had already taken root. But this wasn't just a sudden decision, it was the culmination of something far more deliberate, something that had been quietly building behind closed doors. For years, Catherine was never supposed to be the most powerful figure in the room. Not officially, not publicly, she entered the royal family as an outsider, graceful, polished, but underestimated. And yet, over time, something shifted. Doors opened, voices quieted, decisions began orbiting around her. The woman once defined by her restraint had mastered something far more dangerous: influence without visibility and control without confrontation. In the beginning, she was seen as an addition, not a force. A presence meant to complement, not command. The expectations were clear: support the institution, uphold tradition, and remain within the carefully drawn boundaries that had defined generations before her. And for a while, she did exactly that. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she acted. But what many mistook for passivity was something far more calculated. Because in a system built on hierarchy, the most underestimated person often has the greatest advantage. They are watched the least. Catherine learned quickly, not through instruction, but through proximity. She studied the rhythm of royal life, the unspoken rules that governed every decision, every invitation, every alliance. She noticed who held influence, and more importantly, how they exercised it. Some relied on status, others on history, but the most effective figures, the ones who truly shaped outcomes, operated quietly behind the scenes, where visibility was limited but impact was absolute. And that was where Catherine began to position herself. Trust was her first victory. Not demanded, not rushed, earned, slowly, deliberately, she became someone senior figures could rely on, someone who didn't disrupt, didn't challenge openly, didn't create unnecessary friction. But beneath that calm exterior, she was building something far more powerful than authority given by title. She was building authority earned through consistency, discretion, and precision. And once that trust was established, the doors that had once seemed closed began to open just slightly at first, then wider. It started with small involvement, private discussions, quiet consultations, moments where her opinion was requested, then considered, then quietly followed. At first, it was easy to overlook, a suggestion here, a preference there. But over time, those suggestions stopped being optional. They became expected. Her voice, once secondary, began to carry weight. And then, almost imperceptibly, it became decisive. Decisions that once passed through multiple hands began to settle with her, not officially, not visibly, but undeniably. What made it so effective was that it never looked like a takeover. There was no confrontation, no dramatic assertion of power, just a gradual shift, a rebalancing that felt natural, even necessary. And in that subtlety lay its strength, because by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was no longer something that could be easily undone. The system had already adapted, adjusted, accepted, but not everyone was unaware. There were those within the palace who noticed the shift early, the ones who understood how influence moves, how power evolves. And for them, Catherine's rise was not just surprising, it was unsettling, because she represented something different. Not inherited authority, not traditional hierarchy, but something far more unpredictable. Control built quietly, strategically, and without resistance. And that kind of power is the hardest to challenge, because by the time it becomes visible, it is already deeply embedded. And while the public saw elegance and diplomacy, insiders were beginning to notice something else entirely, a system quietly reshaping itself around her. Royal guest lists were never random, but they were never supposed to belong to one person either. Invitations to royal residences have always been a delicate dance of status, politics, and loyalty. Yet behind the velvet curtains, a new system had emerged. One that filtered every name, every face, every connection through Catherine. And the most unsettling part, many insiders didn't even realize it had already changed. For decades, the process had been layered, almost ritualistic. Names moved through a network of advisors, private secretaries, senior aides, each adding input, each balancing competing interests. It wasn't just about who deserved to be there. It was about who needed to be seen, who needed to be acknowledged, and sometimes who needed to be kept close. The system wasn't perfect, but it was shared. Power was distributed, decisions negotiated. No single voice carried absolute weight. And that balance, fragile as it was, kept the institution steady. But somewhere along the way, that balance began to shift. Quietly, almost invisibly, the layers didn't disappear, they were absorbed. Recommendations still came in, discussions still happened. But the final word no longer echoed across a room. It settled in one place, one perspective, one decision point. Catherine didn't dismantle the system. She restructured it from within, turning a collective process into a controlled channel where every name, every invitation passed through her judgment before becoming reality. At first, it was subtle enough to dismiss. A guest list adjusted here. A last-minute change there. The kind of minor alterations that could easily be explained away by logistics or preference, but patterns began to form. High-profile individuals, people who had always been present, always expected, suddenly absent without explanation, not publicly excluded, not officially removed, just missing, and in their place, new names appeared, unexpected ones, carefully selected ones, people who, in many cases, aligned more closely with a quieter, more controlled vision of influence. Those who paid attention started to feel it before they could fully explain it. Invitations became less predictable, access became more selective, and slowly the realization began to settle in this wasn't coincidence. This was curation, because controlling a guest list isn't just about organizing an event. It's about shaping the room itself. Who speaks, who listens, who forms alliances, who remains on the outside looking in. And with each decision, Catherine wasn't just managing appearances, she was redefining proximity to power. What made it even more unsettling was how seamlessly it all unfolded. There was no announcement, no clear moment where the system visibly changed. It evolved quietly, adapting around her until her role as the final checkpoint felt almost natural, almost inevitable. By the time questions began to surface, the structure had already settled into place. Undoing it would mean unraveling a system that now depended on her precision, her discretion, her control. And within the palace walls, the unease began to grow. Staff members who had once operated with a sense of shared authority now found themselves navigating a different reality. Decisions that once involved discussion now required approval. Conversations that once shaped outcomes now felt like formalities. Some accepted it, recognizing the efficiency. Others resisted, quietly questioning what had been lost in the process. Because while centralized control brings order, it also concentrates power, and concentrated power always carries risk. But with control comes consequence, and not everyone within the palace was willing to accept this silent takeover without resistance. Behind closed doors, the silence didn't last. Whispers turned into quiet objections. Objections turned into conflict. Because, for some within the royal circle, Catherine's control wasn't just unexpected, it was unacceptable. Power, after all, is never surrendered willingly. And as guest lists began to change, so did alliances. The palace wasn't just adjusting, it was dividing. And at the center of it all stood Catherine, calm, unshaken, and seemingly unstoppable. At first, the resistance was careful, almost cautious. No one wanted to be the first to openly challenge a system that had already begun to prove its strength. But tension has a way of surfacing, especially in a place where tradition is treated as law. Senior aides, figures who had spent decades navigating the delicate machinery of royal protocol, began to push back, quietly at first. They questioned decisions, requested clarifications, raised concerns framed as loyalty rather than defiance. But beneath those measured words was something far more volatile, a refusal to accept that the balance of power had shifted beyond their reach. Because for them, this wasn't just about guest lists, it was about authority, about identity, about a structure they had spent years upholding suddenly being rewritten without their consent. These were individuals who understood the monarchy not as a modern institution, but as a living tradition, one that depended on continuity, not concentration of power. And Catherine's system, efficient as it was, represented a break from that continuity, a quiet disruption that threatened to redefine who truly held influence within the palace walls. The clashes weren't explosive, they were controlled, subtle, often hidden beneath layers of politeness. A delayed approval here, a revised list there, conversations that stretched longer than they needed to, filled with carefully chosen words that masked deeper disagreements. But the meaning was clear. The old guard was resisting, not loudly, not recklessly, but persistently. And with each interaction, the divide became more pronounced. Some found themselves caught in the middle. Staff members who had once operated within a shared system now had to navigate a new reality, one where decisions were no longer collaborative, but directed. It wasn't just the guests who felt excluded. It was the decision-makers themselves. People who had once shaped outcomes now found their influence reduced to suggestion. And that shift carried an emotional weight that couldn't be ignored. Frustration turned into quiet resentment. Loyalty began to feel complicated. Because when power centralizes, it doesn't just change outcomes, it changes relationships. And through it all, Catherine remained composed, unmoved. Where others reacted, she observed. Where others resisted, she remained steady. There was no visible struggle, no sign of hesitation. If anything, the opposition seemed to reinforce her position rather than weaken it, because every challenge confirmed what many had already begun to suspect. This wasn't temporary, this wasn't experimental, this was deliberate. And she wasn't stepping back. What made it even more unsettling was the absence of open confrontation. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public disagreements, no clear breaking point, just a slow, undeniable shift in alignment. Conversations became guarded, trust became selective, and within the palace, something began to fracture, not visibly, not completely, but enough to be felt. Silent factions started to form, not declared, not organized, but understood. Those who supported the new structure, those who quietly opposed it, and those who simply tried to survive within it. Because in an institution built on unity, division is the most dangerous development of all. It doesn't explode. It spreads, quietly, gradually, until it reaches a point where the structure itself begins to feel unstable. And, by then, it's no longer about who holds power, but about who is willing to challenge it. But while the resistance grew internally, the real shockwave came when the outside world began to feel the impact of Catherine's decisions. It wasn't the invitations that caused the uproar, it was the absence of them. Influential figures, longtime allies, even expected royal insiders, suddenly missing. At first it seemed like coincidence. Then it became a pattern, and soon it became undeniable. Someone was deciding who belonged and who didn't, and as speculation intensified, one name kept resurfacing: Catherine. At first, those absences were easy to dismiss. A scheduling conflict, a private matter, a quiet reshuffle behind the scenes. That's how it always works in royal circles. Explanations exist, even when they are never spoken aloud. But as the events continued, as more names quietly disappeared from guest lists that once seemed predictable, the silence became harder to ignore. Because these weren't just ordinary guests, these were individuals who had long been considered fixtures, people whose presence was not just expected, but assumed. And yet, one by one, they were no longer there. What made it more unsettling was the precision of it all. This wasn't random exclusion, it was selective, calculated, the kind of absence that tells a story without ever needing to be explained. Some of those left out had history's quiet disagreements, subtle tensions, moments that never made headlines, but were remembered within palace walls. Others had simply fallen out of alignment with a changing vision, and that was the pattern that began to emerge. This wasn't about status. It was about positioning, because in a world where access defines influence, being excluded is not just a social slight, it's a signal. A message delivered without words but understood by everyone watching closely. And as more names failed to appear, that message became impossible to ignore. Something had changed. And whoever was making those decisions wasn't just organizing events, they were reshaping the inner circle itself. The media began to notice, slowly at first, then with growing intensity. Articles questioned the omissions, commentators speculated about shifting alliances, patterns were mapped, timelines analyzed, connections drawn, and with every new absence, the narrative gained momentum. This wasn't coincidence, this was control. And the more the story spread, the more it demanded a central figure, someone whose influence could explain the consistency, the precision, the intent behind it all. And every path led back to Catherine. But what made it even more compelling, more unsettling, was that no official criteria had ever been revealed. There were no public guidelines, no transparent rules. And yet, the logic behind the exclusions began to feel unmistakably clear. Those who aligned remained. Those who complicated, challenged, or disrupted quietly disappeared from the lists. Not publicly rejected, not openly criticized, just removed. And in that quiet removal lay the true weight of the power she held. Because inclusion brings visibility, it maintains relationships, it sustains influence. But exclusion redefines it. It redraws boundaries. It forces people to question where they stand and why. And as that realization spread, the emotional impact became impossible to ignore. Being left out wasn't just disappointing, it was destabilizing. It created uncertainty, tension, even quiet fear. Because if access could be withdrawn so seamlessly, so silently, then no position felt entirely secure, and beyond the palace walls, public curiosity turned into something stronger, something closer to obsession. Every guest list became a subject of scrutiny, every absence a potential Lou. People weren't just watching anymore, they were analyzing, interpreting, trying to understand the logic behind decisions that were never meant to be fully visible. Because when power operates without explanation, it invites speculation, and speculation, once ignited, is impossible to contain. And as the world speculated, one question began to dominate the narrative. Was this control strategic or deeply personal? Was Catherine protecting the monarchy or reshaping it in her own image? That question lingered in every conversation, every headline, every silent exchange within palace walls. Because the more her control became visible, the more it raised an unsettling possibility. This wasn't just about order, this was about vision. And perhaps something even deeper, something personal. At first, the narrative seemed simple. Supporters framed her actions as necessary, even overdue. A monarchy under constant scrutiny needed discipline, needed clarity, needed someone capable of filtering chaos into control. And Catherine, with her measured approach and unwavering composure, appeared to embody exactly that. To them, this wasn't power for its own sake, it was protection, a quiet safeguarding of an institution that had for years been vulnerable to unpredictability, to internal fractures, to the weight of its own history. In that light, her control over guest lists became something strategic, almost essential, a way to ensure that every room, every gathering, reinforced stability rather than risked disruption. But that interpretation didn't sit comfortably with everyone. Because alongside those calculated decisions were moments that felt different, choices that didn't just align with strategy, but hinted at something more selective, more intentional, on a personal level. Certain absences carried emotional weight. Certain inclusions felt deliberate in ways that went beyond protocol. And for those watching closely, the pattern began to blur. Where did strategy end, and where did personal influence begin? Because the two, once intertwined, become almost impossible to separate, and that's where the tension deepened. Inside the palace, history is never truly forgotten. Old tensions, quiet disagreements, unspoken rivalries, they linger beneath the surface, shaping decisions in ways that are rarely acknowledged openly. And some began to wonder if Catherine's choices were influenced not just by the future she envisioned, but by the past she had experienced. Moments where she had been underestimated, times when her position had been questioned, her role quietly challenged. Because power, once gained, often carries the imprint of what it had to overcome. That possibility changed everything, because if her control was purely strategic, it could be understood, even accepted. But if it was personal, if it was shaped by memory, by experience, by quiet emotional undercurrents, then it became something far more unpredictable, something far more human. And human decisions, unlike institutional ones, are rarely neutral. The psychology of it all became impossible to ignore. Catherine didn't assert authority loudly. She didn't demand attention or force compliance. Instead, she operated with a kind of quiet certainty that made resistance feel almost futile. That kind of authority doesn't just guide decisions, it defines them. It shapes the environment in ways that others adapt to, often without realizing it. And that's what made her position so powerful. It wasn't just that she controlled access. It was that her control felt natural, almost inevitable, as if the system had always been moving toward this point. But outside the palace, perception began to fracture. Some saw her as a stabilizing force, a modern figure bringing structure to an institution in need of it. Others saw something more calculated, more controlled, a figure who had quietly positioned herself at the center of influence and was now shaping it according to her own design. And as those interpretations collided, the mystery around her intentions only deepened. Because the truth, whatever it was, remained just out of reach. hidden behind decisions that were never fully explained, patterns that were never officially acknowledged, and the more people tried to define her actions, the more elusive they became, strategic or personal, protective or transformative. The lines blurred, shifted, refused to settle, but as theories spiraled, the palace made a move that would change everything, not by denying the rumors, but by confirming them. Then came the moment no one expected. The palace didn't deny it. They confirmed it, calmly, directly, without hesitation. Catherine controlled the guest lists, not partially, not temporarily, completely. And with that confirmation, speculation turned into reality. The power was real, the authority was undeniable, and the monarchy, as the world understood it, would never look the same again. The statement itself was almost unsettling in its simplicity. No elaborate explanation, no attempt to soften the impact, just a clear acknowledgement that what had once been whispered behind closed doors was now official. And in that moment, everything shifted. Because rumors can be dismissed, speculation can be debated, but confirmation changes the rules entirely. It transforms uncertainty into fact, and once something becomes fact, it demands to be understood. The reaction was immediate, and it was intense. What had once been a quiet undercurrent of curiosity exploded into global conversation. Media outlets that had cautiously speculated now spoke with certainty. Headlines sharpened, analysis deepened. And suddenly, Catherine's role was something to interpret. It was something to confront, because the confirmation didn't just validate the pattern people had been noticing. It elevated it. It gave it weight, permanence. Royal analysts, many of whom had spent years studying the subtle dynamics of influence within the monarchy, found themselves reassessing everything. Past events, once viewed as routine, now carried new meaning. Decisions that seemed minor were re-examined as deliberate, and Catherine herself, once understood through the lens of composure and quiet support, was now being seen in an entirely different light, not just as a participant in the system, but as one of its central architects. Inside the palace, however, the response was far more restrained. Silence took over. Not the kind of silence that suggests uncertainty, but the kind that signals acceptance. Because once something is officially confirmed at that level, it is no longer up for debate internally. It becomes structure, and structure within the monarchy is rarely challenged openly. But that silence carried its own weight. It suggested that what had been revealed was not a disruption, but a reality that had already been integrated. Outside those walls, the conversation intensified. Social platforms filled with analysis, speculation, reaction. Every detail was dissected, every implication explored. People weren't just reacting to the confirmation, they were trying to understand what it meant for the future. Because this wasn't just about guest lists, it was about access, about influence, about who stands close to power and who is kept at a distance. And now, that entire dynamic had a clearly defined center. What made it even more striking was the finality of it all. There was no sense that this was temporary, no indication that it would be revisited or adjusted. The language of the confirmation left no room for ambiguity. His was established, fixed. And once a shift like that is made within an institution as deeply rooted as the monarchy, it doesn't simply reverse, it reshapes everything around it. Because power, once acknowledged, doesn't fade back into the background. It becomes part of the narrative, part of the structure, part of the future. And Catherine's position, once subtle and quietly influential, had now been brought fully into the light, no longer hidden, no longer implied, fully visible and impossible to ignore. But confirmation wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a far more profound transformation within the monarchy itself. Power doesn't always arrive with a crown. Sometimes it moves quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Catherine's control wasn't just a shift, it was a rewriting of the monarchy's internal structure. One decision at a time, one guest list at a time, and as the institution adapted, one truth became undeniable. The future of the monarchy was no longer just inherited, it was being carefully, deliberately shaped, because what had once been an invisible influence was now a defined role, and with that definition came transformation. The monarchy, long rooted in tradition, had always depended on continuity, on the idea that power flowed through established lines, guided by precedent rather than personality. But Catherine's emergence disrupted that quiet certainty, not through rebellion, not through open challenge, but through something far more effective: evolution. She didn't reject tradition, she reinterpreted it, reshaped it, and in doing so, positioned herself not as an exception, but as a new standard. This was not just about guest lists anymore. It was about control over proximity, over who enters the inner circle and who remains at its edge. And in a system where access defines influence, that control becomes something far greater than administrative authority. It becomes structural power, the kind that doesn't just operate within the monarchy, but gradually begins to redefine it. Because when one person determines who is seen, who is heard, and who is included, they are no longer participating in the institution, they are shaping its direction. For legacy figures within the royal family, this shift carried an emotional weight that couldn't be easily dismissed. These were individuals who had lived within a system defined by stability, by predictability, by roles that rarely changed. And now they were witnessing something different, a recalibration, a subtle but undeniable movement away from inherited authority towards something more fluid, more responsive, and perhaps more controlled. For some, it felt necessary, a way to protect the monarchy from the pressures of a rapidly changing world. For others, it felt like a loss, a quiet erosion of a structure they had spent their lives upholding. And yet, the balance between stability and transformation is where the monarchy has always been most vulnerable. Change too little, and it risks becoming irrelevant. Change too much, and it risks losing its identity. Catherine's role exists precisely within that tension. She represents both continuity and disruption, someone who understands tradition deeply enough to preserve it, but also recognizes that preservation sometimes requires reinvention. And that reinvention, when done quietly, can be far more powerful than any visible reform. Outside the palace, public fascination began to settle into something more enduring. This was no longer just a breaking story, it was an evolving narrative. People weren't just reacting to what had happened, they were watching what would happen next, because Catherine's influence introduced a new dynamic, one that blurred the lines between public perception and internal reality. The monarchy was no longer just a symbol of history. It was becoming a reflection of strategy, of calculated decisions made behind closed doors, but felt far beyond them. And at the center of that transformation stood Catherine, not as a figurehead, not as a passive presence, but as an architect, someone who had quietly moved into a position where her decisions didn't just affect events, they defined them. And with that position came a new kind of responsibility, because shaping the future of an institution is not just about control, it's about consequence. Every choice creates ripple effects. Every decision reshapes relationships, expectations, and ultimately, legacy. And yet, even as her influence solidifies, one question remains: what happens next, when power is no longer hidden, but fully exposed? Now that the secret is no longer a secret, everything changes. Power, once invisible, is now undeniable. And with that visibility comes risk, because control invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites challenge. Catherine may hold the guest lists today, but what happens tomorrow? When expectations rise, when resistance returns, when the balance of power is tested once again. Because the moment power steps out of the shadows, it stops being protected by mystery and starts being measured by consequence. And within a monarchy built on perception as much as tradition, that shift is dangerous. What was once quietly accepted can now be openly questioned. Every decision, every inclusion, every exclusion, no longer just internal choices, but public signals waiting to be interpreted, debated, and challenged. The safety of silence has been replaced by the pressure of visibility. And visibility changes behavior, not just for Catherine, but for everyone around her. Because when authority becomes clear, so does opposition. Those who once resisted quietly may begin to reconsider their positio. Those who remained neutral may feel compelled to choose a side. And those who supported her rise may begin to wonder what happens if that power continues to grow unchecked. Because centralized control no matter how effective, always carries a question beneath it: how long can it last before something pushes back? Inside the palace, that question doesn't need to be spoken to be understood. The structure may appear stable, but stability in such an environment is often temporary. History has shown that power within the monarchy rarely remains static. It shifts, adapts, responds to pressure both internal and external. And Catherine's position, as strong as it now appears, exists within that same unpredictable cycle, because the more influence she holds, the more she becomes a focal point, not just of control, but of expectation, and expectations are where the real tension begins. The public, once curious, now watches with intent. Patterns will be tracked more closely. Decisions will be analysed more deeply. What was once subtle will now be scrutinised, and with that scrutiny comes pressure not just to maintain control, but to justify it. Because once people understand where power lies, they begin to question how it is used. And in that questioning lies the potential for conflict, not immediate, not explosive, but gradual and persistent. At the same time, the monarchy itself continues to evolve. It has to. Survival depends on it. And Catherine's role within that evolution is no longer uncertain, it is central. But being central means carrying weight. Every choice she makes now contributes to something larger than the moment. It shapes perception, it defines direction, it influences not just who is present, but what the monarchy becomes. And yet, with all that control, one truth remains unavoidable: power is never absolute. It is always subject to change, to challenge, to foe, races that cannot always be predicted or controlled. New dynamics will emerge, new alliances will form, and somewhere within that shifting landscape, new tensions will begin to take shape, because when one system stabilizes, another begins to adjust. And that is where the uncertainty lingers, not in what has already happened, but in what comes next. Because Catherine's story is no longer about gaining influence, it's about sustaining it, navigating it, defending it against pressures that are only just beginning to surface. And in a structure as complex as the monarchy, the next chapter is never defined by the present, it is shaped by the forces that rise in response to it. Because in a monarchy built on tradition, the most dangerous change is not the one you see, but the one you realize has already happened. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.